The police officer's face went completely white as he stared at the woman standing in the doorway. His clipboard trembled in his hands, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of suburban lawn mowers on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "Judge Richardson?" Officer Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible. "You live here?" Behind him, Linda Thornfield, the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek, stood frozen on the pristine sidewalk, her perfectly manicured finger still pointed accusingly toward the modest two-story house. The smug smile that had been plastered across her face just seconds earlier was rapidly melting into something between confusion and dawning horror. What Linda didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her HOA presidency. And it was about to cost her everything. Let me take you back to where this all started, because this story is about more than just a HOA dispute. It's about power, karma, and what happens when someone who thinks they're untouchable discovers they're not. Meet Linda Thornfield, 52, the kind of woman who measures her self-worth by how many people she can control. For 3 years, she'd ruled the Willow Creek Homeowners Association with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of fake politeness. Picture this: perfectly styled blonde hair that never moved in the wind, designer pantsuits that probably cost more than most people's rent, and a smile that could freeze hell over. Linda lived in the biggest house on Maple Street, a sprawling 4,500 square foot monument to excess with columns that screamed, "Look at me." Her weapon of choice? A thick binder filled with HOA regulations that she knew by heart and wielded like a sword. Late fees, violation notices, architectural review denials. Linda had turned neighborhood management into an art form of petty tyranny. Then there was Judge Helen Richardson, 58, who lived in the modest house at 1247 Oak Drive. Helen had moved to Willow Creek 6 months ago after her retirement from the county court, seeking the peaceful suburban life she dreamed of during her 30-year career on the bench. She was the kind of person who wore cardigans instead of power suits, who preferred gardening to golfing, and who had spent decades ensuring justice was served fairly and without favoritism. Helen had no idea that her quiet retirement was about to be shattered by a woman who had never faced real consequences for her actions. And Linda had no idea that she was about to pick a fight with someone who understood the law better than she understood her own HOA bylaws. It started with Helen's garden. After years of sterile courtrooms and endless legal briefs, Helen had discovered a passion for horticulture. Her backyard had become her sanctuary, tomato plants climbing wooden stakes, herbs arranged in neat rows, and flower beds that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. It was beautiful, natural, and according to Linda Thornfield, a complete violation of HOA standards. The first notice appeared on Helen's door on a Monday morning in early September. The official HOA letterhead couldn't disguise the petty tone. Violation notice, property 1247 Oak Drive. Dear homeowner, your property has been found in violation of Willow Creek HOA Guidelines Section 4.2.1, unsightly yard maintenance and unapproved landscaping modifications. You have 30 days to correct these violations or face escalating fines. Violations observed. Vegetable garden visible from street view. Non-approved plant varieties. Garden structures not submitted for architectural review. First violation fine, $250. Sincerely, Linda Thornfield, HOA President. Helen read the notice twice, her judicial mind automatically analyzing the language. She'd dealt with worse intimidation tactics in her courtroom, but this felt different, more personal, more vindictive. Still, she decided to handle it the way she'd handled difficult situations her entire career, with facts and calm professionalism. That afternoon, Helen knocked on Linda's imposing front door. When Linda answered, dressed as if she was attending a board meeting instead of sitting at home, Helen smiled warmly. "Mrs. Thornfield? I'm Helen Richardson from Oak Drive. I received this notice about my garden, and I was hoping we could discuss it." Linda's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of someone who sensed weakness. "Of course, dear. Though I should mention, the violations are quite clear. We simply can't have vegetable gardens disrupting our neighborhood's aesthetic standards." "I understand your concern," Helen replied, pulling out a folder she'd prepared. "But I've reviewed the HOA covenants, and I couldn't find any specific prohibition against vegetable gardens. Section 4.2.1 mentions unsightly yard maintenance, but it doesn't define what constitutes unsightly. Additionally, my garden isn't visible from the main street. It's in my backyard, behind a privacy fence. Linda's smile tightened. She wasn't used to homeowners who actually read the fine print. Well, the Architectural Review Committee, which I chair, has determined that your garden structures violate our aesthetic guidelines. What Architectural Review Committee? Helen asked politely. According to the HOA bylaws, any Architectural Review Committee must consist of at least 3 board members, and all decisions must be voted on at official meetings with proper notice to residents. For just a moment, Linda's composure cracked. The truth was, there was no committee. Linda made all the decisions herself and rubber-stamped them with official-looking documents. But she recovered quickly, her voice taking on a condescending tone that had intimidated dozens of neighbors into compliance. Mrs. Richardson, I think you're overcomplicating things. The bottom line is that your garden violates our community standards. You can either remove it voluntarily, or will be forced to escalate the fines. Trust me, it's much easier to just comply. Helen's 3 decades of judicial experience had taught her to recognize bullies, and Linda Thornfield was textbook. But Helen also knew something Linda didn't. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them hang themselves with their own rope. I see, Helen said calmly. Well, I'll certainly take your comments under advisement. Have a good day, Mrs. Thornfield. Linda interpreted Helen's polite response as surrender, and that was her first mistake. Over the next 2 weeks, she threw everything in her HOA arsenal at the quiet woman on Oak Drive. Violation notice number 2 arrived via certified mail. Second violation notice, escalated fine, $500. Failure to comply within 15 days will result in further action. Helen's response was a carefully crafted letter requesting copies of all HOA board meeting minutes for the past year, a current roster of all committee members, and documentation of the voting procedures used to approve her specific violations. She sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. Linda's response was swift and brutal. She called an emergency HOA meeting, attended only by herself and 2 neighbors she'd bullied into serving as puppet board members. The result was violation notice number 3, final violation notice, escalated fine, $1,500. Total amount due, $2,250. Payment required within 10 days or legal action will be pursued. But Linda wasn't done. She began driving past Helen's house multiple times per day, photographing every inch of the property. She sent additional violation notices for excessive garden hose visibility, $200, unapproved doormat color, $150, and mailbox positioning violation, $300. Helen watched this escalation with the same detached professionalism she'd used to observe overzealous prosecutors in her courtroom. She documented everything, every photograph Linda took, every violation notice, every inconsistency in the HOA's supposed procedures. She also began her own investigation, requesting public records about the HOA's legal standing and reviewing the community's original incorporation documents. What she discovered was fascinating. The Willow Creek HOA was technically legitimate, but Linda had been operating it like her personal fiefdom. Board meetings were held irregularly and often without proper notice. Financial records were incomplete. Most tellingly, Linda had been assessing fines that exceeded the amounts authorized in the original HOA agreement. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Helen found Linda in her backyard, measuring her tomato plants with a tape measure while taking photos. "Excuse me," Helen called out, her voice carrying the authority that had once silenced courtrooms. "You're trespassing on private property." Linda spun around, her face flushed with indignation. "I have every right to inspect properties for HOA violations." "No," Helen said calmly, "you don't. The HOA agreement grants inspection rights for external property visible from common areas only. You have no legal authority to enter my backyard without permission." "Don't lecture me about legal authority," Linda snapped. "I've been running this HOA longer than you've lived here. If you can't follow simple community standards, maybe you should find somewhere else to live. That was Linda's second mistake, threatening a retired judge with forced relocation. Helen's voice remained perfectly calm, but her eyes took on the steel that had once made defense attorneys reconsider their strategies. Mrs. Thornfield, I'm going to ask you to leave my property immediately. Any further contact regarding these alleged violations should be conducted through proper legal channels. Fine, Linda snarled, her mask of suburban politeness finally slipping completely. But you haven't heard the last of this. When I'm done, your little garden will be gone, and you'll be paying every penny of those fines plus interest. The total violation amount had somehow ballooned to $3,500 by the time Linda's final ultimatum arrived. The letter was a masterpiece of legal-sounding threats written by someone who clearly didn't understand actual law. Final demand for payment, $3,500 due immediately. Mrs. Richardson, this is your final opportunity to resolve these violations before we pursue all available legal remedies, including liens against your property, forced compliance through civil action, and potential criminal charges for willful violation of community standards. Payment must be received within 72 hours or we will contact law enforcement regarding your continued criminal behavior. Linda Thornfield, HOA President. Helen read the letter twice, then did something Linda would never have expected. She laughed. In 30 years on the bench, she'd seen plenty of frivolous lawsuits and empty threats, but this one was particularly amusing. Linda had just committed several potential legal violations of her own, including harassment, trespassing, and now threats to file false criminal charges. But Helen decided to let Linda dig her hole a little deeper. She crafted a response that was a masterclass in legal precision disguised as suburban politeness. Dear Mrs. Thornfield, I am in receipt of your recent correspondence dated October 15th. While I appreciate your diligence regarding community standards, I must respectfully dispute both the validity of the alleged violations and the authority of the HOA to assess the fines in question. As I've previously indicated, I would be happy to address these matters through proper legal channels. I have retained counsel and look forward to resolving the situation in accordance with applicable law and the HOA's governing documents. I trust you understand that any further contact regarding this matter should be directed through my attorney's office. Sincerely, Helen Richardson. She included the business card of Patricia Williams, one of the city's most respected civil litigation attorneys and a former colleague from Helen's judicial days. Linda's response was exactly what Helen had hoped for, complete escalation. Instead of backing down or seeking legal advice, Linda doubled down. She filed a complaint with the local police department, claiming Helen was willfully violating community standards and refusing to comply with lawful orders. Officer Carlos Martinez had been with the Metro Police Department for 8 years, and he'd handled his share of neighborhood disputes. When the call came in about an ongoing criminal violation of community standards, he sighed and grabbed his clipboard. HOA disputes were typically resolved with patience, mediation, and a gentle reminder that civil matters weren't criminal ones. Linda met him at the curb outside Helen's house, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. She wore her most authoritative pantsuit and carried a thick folder of documentation that she thrust at Officer Martinez before he'd even gotten out of his patrol car. Officer, thank goodness you're here, Linda began, her voice taking on the performatively concerned tone she'd perfected. I've been trying to resolve this situation for weeks, but Mrs. Richardson simply refuses to comply with our community standards. She's willfully violating our HOA agreement, and I believe she may be engaging in criminal behavior. Officer Martinez glanced through Linda's folder, violation notices, photographs of tomato plants, and a rambling complaint letter that used the word criminal 17 times. His experience told him this was exactly the kind of civil dispute that had no business involving law enforcement, but Linda was insistent. Ma'am, I need to explain that HOA violations are typically civil matters, not criminal ones. The police department generally doesn't. But she's willfully violating lawful orders. Linda interrupted. I've given her multiple chances to comply, and she's refused every time. That has to be some kind of obstruction or contempt, right? Officer Martinez rubbed his temples. He could already see how this was going to go. He'd knock on the door, explain to the homeowner that this was a civil matter, and recommend they consult an attorney. Then he'd spend 20 minutes explaining to the HOA president why police couldn't arrest someone for growing tomatoes. All right, Mrs. Thornfield, I'll speak with the homeowner. But I want to be clear that if this is a civil HOA dispute, there's very little the police department can do. Linda's smile was triumphant. Oh, I think once she sees you're taking this seriously, she'll be much more cooperative. They walked up the neat pathway to Helen's front door, Linda's heels clicking against the concrete with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to watch her enemy surrender. Officer Martinez knocked politely and waited. The door opened, and Officer Martinez found himself looking at a woman in her late 50s, wearing gardening clothes and a concerned expression. She looked completely normal, certainly not like someone engaged in criminal behavior. Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Officer Martinez with Metro PD. I've received a complaint regarding some alleged violations of your HOA agreement, and I wanted to speak with you about the situation. Of course, officer, Helen replied calmly. I've been expecting this. Please come in. It was Linda who stepped forward first, practically pushing past Officer Martinez in her eagerness to confront Helen directly. Now maybe you'll listen to reason, Mrs. Richardson. When the police get involved, people tend to take things more seriously. Helen looked at Linda with the same expression she'd once reserved for defendants who represented themselves in court, patient, slightly pitying, but ultimately professional. Mrs. Thornfield, I believe I asked you to direct all further communication through my attorney. Your attorney? Linda laughed, a sharp sound that carried more than a hint of hysteria. Please. You're just trying to intimidate me with legal threats, but it won't work. Officer Martinez here is going to explain to you exactly what happens when people think they're above community standards. Officer Martinez was beginning to feel like he'd walked into the middle of a soap opera. Both women seemed intelligent and articulate, but there was clearly more going on here than a simple garden dispute. He decided to take control of the situation. Ladies, let me explain how this works. HOA violations are civil matters, which means... Excuse me, Officer Martinez, Helen interrupted gently. Before we continue, I think there might be some confusion here. Could you tell me your full name and badge number for my records? Certainly. Officer Carlos Martinez, badge number 2847. Ma'am, may I ask why you need that information? Helen smiled, and something in that smile made Linda's stomach drop, though she couldn't quite understand why. Well, Officer Martinez, I like to keep accurate records of all legal proceedings. It's a habit I developed during my career. Your career? Officer Martinez asked, suddenly curious. I'm recently retired, Helen said calmly. I was a judge in the County Superior Court for 30 years. Judge Helen Richardson. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Officer Martinez's clipboard clattered to the ground as his face went completely white. Behind him, Linda made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Judge Richardson? Officer Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible. You live here? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Officer Martinez stared at Helen with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd walked into a trap. Linda stood frozen behind him, her brain struggling to process what she'd just heard. Judge Richardson. The Judge Richardson. The woman who had presided over some of the county's most high-profile cases. The judge who was known for her fairness, her encyclopedic knowledge of the law, and her absolute intolerance for frivolous litigation and abuse of the legal system. Helen watched the recognition dawn on Officer Martinez's face with the same calm patience she'd shown countless attorneys who suddenly realized they'd made a critical error in their arguments. Officer Martinez, Helen said gently, I believe you've testified in my courtroom several times over the years. The Gonzalez robbery case last spring, if I'm not mistaken? You did excellent work on that investigation. Yes, Your Honor, Officer Martinez stammered, automatically using the title of respect he'd used hundreds of times before. I mean. He took a deep breath and tried to regain his composure. Judge Richardson, I had no idea you lived in this neighborhood. Linda finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. You're a judge? Helen turned to Linda with the same expression she'd used when attorneys made procedural errors in her courtroom. I was a judge, Mrs. Thornfield. I retired 6 months ago. I thought I'd mentioned that when we first met, but perhaps it slipped my mind. The truth was, Helen had deliberately avoided mentioning her career. She'd moved to Willow Creek specifically to escape the world of law and litigation, to enjoy her retirement in peace. But Linda's escalating harassment had made anonymity impossible. Officer Martinez was quickly connecting the dots. He'd responded to what he thought was a simple neighbor dispute, only to discover that one of the neighbors was a retired Superior Court judge and the criminal violations were tomato plants. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, his voice taking on a much more formal tone, could you clarify exactly what criminal activity you believe has occurred here? Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Suddenly, all her confident legal terminology seemed ridiculous. Criminal behavior? Willful violation of lawful orders? She was talking about a vegetable garden to a police officer in front of a retired judge who had probably heard every frivolous legal argument imaginable. She's violating our HOA agreement, Linda finally managed. She received official violation notices, and she refused to comply. That has to be some kind of contempt or obstruction. Helen stepped forward slightly, her voice taking on the patient but authoritative tone she'd used to explain basic legal concepts to confused defendants. Officer Martinez, as I'm sure you know, HOA violations are strictly civil matters. There's no criminal statute that makes gardening a misdemeanor, regardless of what community agreements might say. Mrs. Thornfield appears to have misunderstood the difference between civil and criminal law. Officer Martinez nodded, grateful to have the situation clarified by someone who actually understood the legal system. That's correct, Judge Richardson. Ma'am, he said, turning to Linda, I need to explain that filing false police reports about alleged criminal activity is itself a serious matter. Linda's face went from red to white to green in rapid succession. False police report? But she's violating our community standards. Community standards aren't criminal law, Mrs. Thornfield, Helen said calmly. And I should mention, Officer Martinez, that Mrs. Thornfield has been engaging in some questionable behavior herself. She's been trespassing on my property, photographing my home and garden multiple times per day, and has attempted to assess fines that exceed the authority granted in the HOA's governing documents. Officer Martinez looked at his clipboard, then at Linda, then at the modest house with its neat garden visible in the backyard. The absurdity of the situation was becoming clear. Mrs. Thornfield, I think we need to have a serious conversation about appropriate dispute resolution and the proper use of police resources. But Linda wasn't listening. Her world was crumbling around her, and she could feel the control she'd wielded so carefully slipping away. In her desperation, she made her biggest mistake yet. I don't care if she's a judge, Linda shouted, her voice rising to near hysteria. The law is the law, and HOA agreements are legally binding contracts. She signed that agreement, and she needs to follow it, or she can get out of our neighborhood. Helen raised an eyebrow at Linda's outburst, recognizing the behavior she'd seen from dozens of pro-SE litigants who had convinced themselves they understood legal concepts they'd only heard about on television. Mrs. Thornfield, Helen said, her judicial patience beginning to show some strain, you seem to have several fundamental misunderstandings about contract law, property rights, and the legal authority of homeowners associations. She turned to Officer Martinez, who was now taking notes with the grim concentration of someone who realized the situation was about to require a very detailed report. Officer, I'd like to clarify a few things for the record. First, Mrs. Thornfield has been operating this HOA in violation of its own governing documents. Board meetings haven't been held according to the prescribed schedule, financial records are inadequate, and the Architectural Review Committee she references doesn't actually exist according to the HOA's Articles of Incorporation. Linda sputtered, "That's not true. I have the authority to." Second, Helen continued, the fines she's attempted to assess exceed the maximum amounts specified in the community agreement by more than 400%. Third, several of the alleged violations don't actually exist in the HOA covenants. She appears to have invented rules that have no legal standing. Officer Martinez looked up from his notepad. Judge Richardson, are you saying that Mrs. Thornfield has been making up violations? I'm saying that Mrs. Thornfield appears to have been operating under the mistaken belief that being HOA president grants her unlimited authority to create and enforce rules as she sees fit. Unfortunately, that's not how contract law works. Linda's composure finally snapped completely. You think you can just move into our neighborhood and ignore our rules because you're some fancy retired judge? Well, I've got news for you. I don't care what your background is. I've been running this HOA for 3 years, and I'm not going to let some outsider come in here and destroy everything I've built. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Officer Martinez stopped writing and stared at Linda, while Helen simply nodded as if Linda had confirmed something she'd already suspected. Mrs. Thornfield, Officer Martinez said slowly, did you just admit that you've been personally creating and enforcing HOA rules without proper authority? No. That's not what I meant. Linda backpedaled frantically. I meant that I've been following the rules as written, and she's the one who's refusing to comply. Helen opened her own folder, the one she'd been quietly preparing for weeks, and handed several documents to Officer Martinez. Officer, these are copies of the original HOA incorporation documents, the community agreement all homeowners signed, and a detailed analysis of the discrepancies between what Mrs. Thornfield claims the rules say and what they actually say. You'll notice that of the 14 violations she's claimed against my property, only 2 are actually mentioned in the governing documents, and both of those have been misapplied. Officer Martinez scanned the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. As someone who testified regularly in court, he knew the difference between legitimate legal documentation and someone's creative interpretation of the rules. Mrs. Thornfield, he said, these documents suggest that you've been assessing fines for violations that don't exist in your HOA agreement. That's ridiculous. Linda snapped. I know those rules better than anyone. She stopped abruptly, realizing she was about to admit again that she'd been making up rules as she went along. Helen stepped forward with the calm authority that had once commanded courtrooms. Mrs. Thornfield, I'd like to give you an opportunity to resolve this situation amicably. I propose that you rescind all violation notices issued to my property, refund any fines paid by other residents for violations that don't exist in the actual governing documents, and call a properly noticed HOA meeting to elect a new board according to the procedures specified in your articles of incorporation. Absolutely not. Linda shouted. You can't just waltz in here and take over. This is my neighborhood, my HOA. Actually, Helen said quietly, it's not. It's a community governed by a legal agreement that you've been violating consistently. And Officer Martinez, I should mention that Mrs. Thornfield's threat to contact law enforcement regarding criminal behavior in her final violation notice could potentially constitute filing a false police report, particularly since she knew the alleged violations were civil matters. Officer Martinez looked at Linda with the expression of someone who was rapidly losing patience. Ma'am, I need to advise you that making false reports to police is a misdemeanor offense. Additionally, harassment and trespassing are also criminal matters. Linda's world was imploding and she knew it. But instead of admitting defeat gracefully, she made one last desperate play. Fine. You want to play legal games? I'll show you legal games. I'm calling my lawyer, and we're going to sue you for everything you're worth. Property damage, emotional distress, interference with HOA operations. By the time I'm done with you, you'll wish you'd never moved to this neighborhood. Helen listened to Linda's threats with the same expression she'd worn while listening to defendants explain why traffic laws shouldn't apply to them. When Linda finally finished her rant, Helen smiled, not the polite suburban smile she'd been using, but the smile that had once made experienced attorneys reconsider their litigation strategies. Mrs. Thornfield, I appreciate your enthusiasm for legal action. In fact, I think that's an excellent idea. Linda blinked, clearly not expecting that response. What? Officer Martinez, Helen continued, I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding Mrs. Thornfield's behavior. Specifically, I'm alleging harassment, trespassing, filing false police reports, and fraud in connection with her assessment of non-existent HOA violations. Officer Martinez nodded, pulling out his official complaint forms. After 8 years on the force, he'd learned to recognize when a situation had shifted from civil dispute to potential criminal matter. Additionally, Helen said, opening another folder, I'll be filing a civil lawsuit against Mrs. Thornfield personally and the HOA for violation of fiduciary duty, breach of contract, harassment, and fraudulent assessment of fees. I've already retained Patricia Williams as my attorney. I believe you know her work, Officer Martinez. Officer Martinez whistled low. Patricia Williams was one of the city's most feared civil litigators, known for her meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examinations. Linda's face had gone completely white. You can't sue the HOA. I was acting in my official capacity. Actually, Helen said, when HOA board members act outside their authority or violate their fiduciary duties, they lose the protection of their official capacity. It's called ultra vires action, acting beyond one's legal authority. And Mrs. Thornfield, you've been acting ultra vires for months. She handed another set of documents to Officer Martinez. These are copies of complaint letters I've received from other residents in the neighborhood. It appears Mrs. Thornfield has been engaging in similar behavior with multiple homeowners. Mrs. Jennifer Collins on Elm Street was fined $800 for excessive holiday decorations that lasted 2 days past New Year's. Mr. Robert Chen on Pine Avenue was assessed $1,200 for unauthorized fence repairs that were actually routine maintenance specifically allowed in the HOA agreement. Officer Martinez flipped through the complaints, his expression growing grimmer. This wasn't a single dispute between neighbors. This was a pattern of systematic abuse of authority. There's more, Helen continued. Mrs. Thornfield has been depositing HOA fines into a personal account rather than the community account specified in the governing documents. Based on my analysis of the public financial records, approximately $12,000 in fines collected over the past year cannot be accounted for in the HOA's official budget. Linda made a strangled sound. Those were administrative fees. I'm entitled to compensation for my time. Not according to your HOA agreement, Helen replied. Board positions are voluntary, and any compensation must be approved by a vote of the full membership. When did that vote take place, Mrs. Thornfield? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Officer Martinez looked up from the documents, his expression now completely professional. Mrs. Thornfield, I need you to understand that these allegations are serious. Misappropriation of HOA funds, fraud, harassment. These aren't civil matters anymore. Linda's last desperate gambit came out as a near scream. She's lying. She's making this up because she doesn't want to follow the rules. Check with the other board members. They'll tell you I have the authority. Helen nodded to Officer Martinez. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Officer, the other board members are supposedly Mrs. Barbara Kent and Mr. David Murphy. I have their contact information here. She handed over another sheet of paper. However, I should mention that when I contacted them last week, Mrs. Kent informed me she resigned from the board 8 months ago and was never told about any of the meetings Mrs. Thornfield claims were held. Mr. Murphy said he's never actually attended a board meeting and was told his role was purely ceremonial. Officer Martinez stared at the contact information, then at Linda, whose face had gone from white to gray. Mrs. Thornfield, are you telling me you've been operating as a one-person HOA board for almost a year? Linda's voice came out as barely a whisper. They didn't want to be involved in the day-to-day operations. Someone had to make decisions. Someone had to follow the legal procedures specified in your governing documents, Helen corrected gently. Mrs. Thornfield, what you've done isn't just inappropriate, it's potentially criminal fraud. Officer Martinez closed his notepad and looked at both women. Mrs. Thornfield, I need you to understand that filing a false police report is a serious matter. Additionally, based on Judge Richardson's documentation, there may be grounds for criminal charges related to fraud and harassment. I strongly recommend you consult with an attorney immediately. He turned to Helen with obvious respect. Judge Richardson, would you like to proceed with filing formal complaints? Helen paused, studying Linda's devastated expression. In her years on the bench, she'd learned to distinguish between malicious criminals and people who had made serious mistakes. Linda was clearly in the latter category, a small-town tyrant who had gotten drunk on petty power and convinced herself she was above the rules she imposed on others. Officer Martinez, I think I'd prefer to give Mrs. Thornfield an opportunity to make this right before we proceed with criminal charges. Linda looked up with desperate hope. What do you mean? I mean, Helen said, that you have 48 hours to do the following. First, rescind all violation notices and fines issued to every resident for violations that don't exist in the actual HOA governing documents. Second, return all money collected from fraudulent fines to the appropriate residents. Third, call a properly noticed meeting of the full HOA membership to elect a new board. Fourth, resign from your position as president and recuse yourself from any future HOA leadership roles. She paused, her expression softening slightly. If you do all of that, and if there are no further instances of harassment or abuse of authority, I'll be satisfied with civil remedies for the damages you've caused. But Mrs. Thornfield, if you choose to continue this behavior, I will pursue every available legal remedy, both civil and criminal. Linda stared at Helen for a long moment, the weight of her situation finally sinking in. She had gone from suburban queen to potential criminal defendant in the span of 30 minutes, and it was entirely her own doing. I need time to think, she whispered. You have 48 hours, Helen replied. After that, Officer Martinez will be receiving my formal complaints. The transformation of Willow Creek began exactly 47 hours and 23 minutes after Officer Martinez left Helen's driveway. Linda Thornfield, faced with the choice between admitting her mistakes and facing criminal charges, chose the former. The emergency HOA meeting was held at the community center on a Saturday morning, and it was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. For the first time in 3 years, every resident received proper legal notice. For the first time ever, the meeting was conducted according to the parliamentary procedures specified in the governing documents. Linda arrived looking 10 years older, clutching a folder of resignation letters and refund checks. Her opening statement was brief and, for Linda, surprisingly humble. I need to apologize to this community. I've made serious errors in my interpretation and enforcement of our HOA agreement. Effective immediately, I'm resigning as president and from the board entirely. The refunds totaled $8,400, money that Linda had to pull from her personal savings to repay the fraudulent fines she'd assessed over the past year. Jennifer Collins got back her $800 holiday decoration fine. Robert Chen was refunded his $1,200 fence repair assessment. A dozen other residents received smaller amounts for violations that had never actually existed. The election of the new board was refreshingly democratic. Helen was nominated for president but declined, preferring to serve as an advisor to help ensure the HOA operated according to its legal requirements. Instead, Jennifer Collins, the woman who'd been fined for excessive holiday decorations, was elected president. Robert Chen became vice president, and 3 other residents who had been quietly suffering under Linda's regime joined the board. Their first official act was to pass a resolution requiring all future HOA decisions to be made by majority vote of the full board, with proper notice and documentation. Officer Martinez later told his colleagues that it was the strangest call he'd ever responded to. He'd arrived expecting to mediate a garden dispute and ended up witnessing the downfall of a suburban dictator. The story became legendary at the police station, though Martinez was always careful to respect Judge Richardson's privacy when telling it. Linda's fall from grace was swift and complete. Within a week of the emergency meeting, she had put her house on the market. The for sale sign that appeared on her pristine lawn was perhaps the most satisfying sight the neighborhood had seen in years. But the most telling moment came 3 days after the meeting, when Helen was working in her garden and noticed Linda's car pull up to the curb. Linda sat there for nearly 10 minutes, just staring at the tomato plants that had started this entire saga. Finally, she got out of the car and walked slowly up the driveway. Helen looked up from her cucumber plants, dirt on her hands and genuine curiosity on her face. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure what to expect. Mrs. Richardson, Linda said quietly, I owe you an apology. A real one. Helen straightened, studying Linda's face. The arrogance and entitlement were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. I've been thinking about what you said, Linda continued, about how I let power go to my head. You were right. I became everything I used to complain about when I lived in my old neighborhood. I became the person I swore I'd never be. She gestured toward the garden, her voice growing smaller. Your tomatoes, they're actually beautiful. I was so focused on control that I couldn't see that. Helen pulled off her gardening gloves and really looked at Linda, not as the antagonist who had made her life miserable, but as another human being who had lost her way. Linda, she said gently, we all make mistakes. The measure of who we are isn't whether we stumble, it's whether we learn from the fall. Linda nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted you to know that I understand what I did wrong. And I'm grateful that you gave me a chance to make it right instead of just destroying me. Everyone deserves a second chance, Helen replied. What matters now is what you do with it. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two women who had been bitter enemies finding a moment of mutual understanding. Where will you go? Helen asked. Back to Illinois. My sister lives there, and she's been telling me for years that I need to find some perspective. Linda managed a weak smile. I think she was right. After Linda left, Helen returned to her garden with a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The ordeal was over, but more importantly, it had ended with redemption rather than destruction. Word of the Willow Creek HOA revolution spread through social media like wildfire. Jennifer Collins, the new president, posted about the experience on the neighborhood Facebook group, and the story was shared hundreds of times within days. Sometimes, she wrote, it takes someone with real knowledge and courage to stand up to bullies who hide behind fake authority. Judge Richardson didn't just save her garden, she saved our entire community from years more of abuse. The impact rippled far beyond Willow Creek. HOA reform groups across the state began using Helen's documentation methods as a template for challenging abusive board practices. The Richardson Protocol, as it came to be known, involved systematically reviewing HOA governing documents, documenting violations of proper procedures, and building legal cases against rogue board members. Patricia Williams, Helen's attorney, received dozens of calls from residents in other neighborhoods dealing with similar situations. What Helen did, Patricia explained to a local news reporter, was demonstrate that HOA boards aren't above the law. They have to follow their own rules, just like everyone else. The legal precedent was significant too. Linda's case became a cautionary tale in HOA management seminars across the region. Property management companies began requiring better training for board members, emphasizing the difference between authority and authoritarianism. But perhaps the most important impact was on the individuals involved. Robert Chin, who had been quietly enduring Linda's harassment for over a year, found his voice again. He became an advocate for proper HOA governance and helped establish a regional network for residents dealing with abusive associations. Jennifer Collins discovered a talent for leadership she never knew she had. Under her presidency, Willow Creek became one of the most harmoniously run HOAs in the city, with transparent financial records, regular community events, and, most importantly, actual enforcement of only the rules that actually existed. Even Officer Martinez benefited from the experience. His detailed report on the case became part of the police department's training materials on civil versus criminal matters, helping other officers recognize the difference between legitimate complaints and abuse of the legal system. 6 months later, Helen's garden was in full bloom. The tomatoes Linda had fought so hard to eliminate were producing their second harvest, and Helen had expanded her beds to include herbs, peppers, and a small greenhouse for winter growing. She was tending to her basil plants when Officer Martinez stopped by for what had become a monthly informal visit. Helen had invited him to drop by whenever he was in the neighborhood, both because she enjoyed his company and because his presence served as a gentle reminder to anyone who might be tempted to follow in Linda's footsteps. "How's retirement treating you, Judge?" he asked, accepting a glass of iced tea and settling into one of the garden chairs Helen had added to her patio. "Better than I expected," Helen replied, settling into the chair across from him. Though I have to admit, I miss the intellectual challenge of the courtroom sometimes. Well, you certainly got some intellectual challenge from Mrs. Thornfield. Helen laughed, a sound filled with genuine warmth. You know, Carlos, I've been thinking about that. In all my years on the bench, I dealt with criminals, civil disputes, family conflicts, but Linda was different. She wasn't malicious in the traditional sense. She was just lost. She gazed out over her garden, watching a butterfly land on her marigolds. Power corrupts, as they say, but it's more subtle than that. Linda convinced herself that being in control was the same thing as being right. She forgot that authority without accountability is just tyranny on a small scale. Do you think she learned from it? Martinez asked. I hope so. Jennifer Collins got a postcard from her last month. Apparently she's volunteering at a community garden in Springfield. Maybe she found a healthier way to channel her need to nurture something. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the late afternoon sun and the gentle buzz of bees working among Helen's flowers. You know what I learned from all this? Helen said eventually. What's that? Retirement doesn't mean stepping away from justice. It just means finding new ways to serve it. I spent 30 years ensuring fairness from the bench. Now I can ensure fairness from my garden. As Helen often reflected in the months that followed, the Willow Creek HOA incident became a perfect case study in several important principles that extend far beyond suburban neighborhood disputes. First, there's the danger of unchecked authority. Linda's transformation from concerned neighbor to petty tyrant didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of small compromises and increasing power without corresponding accountability. Every time she bent a rule in her favor or made a decision without proper consultation, she moved further from legitimate leadership and closer to authoritarianism. Second, there's the power of knowledge and preparation. Helen's victory wasn't achieved through anger or confrontation, but through careful research, meticulous documentation, and a deep understanding of the legal framework that governed their community. She proved that knowledge really is power, and that the best way to fight injustice is often through the very systems that are being abused. Third, there's the importance of standing up to bullies, especially when, it's easier to just comply. Every resident who quietly paid Linda's fraudulent fines enabled her behavior. It took someone with the knowledge and courage to say no, to break the cycle. But perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates the value of proportional justice. Helen had the power to completely destroy Linda, to pursue criminal charges that could have resulted in jail time, to sue for damages that could have bankrupted her, to use her judicial connections to ensure Linda's reputation was ruined beyond repair. Instead, she chose a path that held Linda accountable while still allowing for redemption. Justice, Helen had often told young attorneys in her courtroom, isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. The goal should be to make things right, not just to make the wrongdoer suffer. The Willow Creek situation proved that principle beautifully. Linda was held accountable for her actions, the community was restored to proper governance, and everyone, even Linda herself, had the opportunity to grow from the experience. Today, Helen Richardson's garden is the pride of Willow Creek. Her tomatoes, the ones that Linda Thornfield tried so desperately to eliminate, now produce enough harvest that Helen shares with the entire neighborhood each summer. The community has an annual garden tour that showcases residents' landscaping efforts, something that would have been impossible under Linda's regime of rigid conformity. The HOA operates smoothly under Jennifer Collins' leadership, with transparent meetings, fair enforcement of actual rules, and a community spirit that Linda's authoritarian approach had nearly destroyed. Property values in Willow Creek have actually increased since the changeover, proving that harmony and fairness are better for everyone than fear and control. Linda Thornfield never returned to Willow Creek, but according to mutual friends, she's found happiness in Illinois. She volunteers at a community garden, helps elderly neighbors with their yard work, and has reportedly become an advocate for HOA reform in her new community. Sometimes the best outcome of confronting a bully is that they learn to become something better. Officer Martinez still tells the story of the judge and the garden, though he's careful to emphasize the lessons rather than the drama. The thing about bullies, he often says, is that they count on people not fighting back. But when someone does fight back, especially someone who knows how. The bully usually discovers they were never as powerful as they thought. Helen continues to serve her community, not as a judge but as a citizen who understands that justice isn't something that only happens in courtrooms. Sometimes it happens in gardens, in neighborhood meetings, and in quiet moments when someone chooses to stand up for what's right instead of what's easy. And every time she waters her tomatoes, Helen Richardson smiles and remembers that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can have the biggest impact. Her garden wasn't just about growing vegetables. It was about growing a community where everyone could flourish. So the next time you encounter someone who's drunk on petty power, whether it's an HOA president, a middle manager, or anyone else who mistakes authority for wisdom, remember Helen Richardson's example. Do your research. Document everything. Know your rights. And never be afraid to stand up for what's right, even when it would be easier to just comply. Because in the end, bullies only have as much power as we give them. And sometimes, all it takes is one person with the knowledge and courage to say no, to change everything. What would you have done in Helen's situation? Have you ever dealt with someone who abused their authority? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Remember, justice doesn't always wear a robe and carry a gavel. Sometimes it wears gardening gloves and carries a watering can.